Scott, it's so great to have you joining me on the Nothing is Wasted podcast. Thanks for being here.
Good being with you, David.
Davey,
appreciate the invitation.
It's all right. It's for some reason the nickname just stuck. I couldn't get rid of it. I tried doing that in college, and nobody seemed to want to call me David. So
it's a great nickname.
I'm so excited about having this conversation because your work on particularly the topics of anxiety and depression is prolific. I mean, there's so many of us some of my team that we're diving into your writing all the time, and we're listening to you, and so I'm honored that we get to sit down and have a conversation and bring some of your voice to our community, because I know a lot of people are dealing with this right now. But I would love, in case some of our community doesn't know who Scott Sauls is, would you give us just a little context for who you are, maybe a little bit about your family, what you do, where you live?
Sure. So my family, I'm married to Patty, and we have been married now for just over 26 years. And we have two daughters. Oldest is Abby. She's now out of college, working in Atlanta, Georgia area with a nonprofit there, and getting married this coming March 26th. So we're really excited about that. And our youngest daughter, Ellie, is 19 years old and a sophomore at Auburn University. And for the last almost 10 years, I've been serving as senior pastor of Christ Presbyterian Church in Nashville, Tennessee, where we came by way of New York City, where I was on the team as a preaching and congregational pastor with Redeemer Presbyterian Church. Some of your listeners may have heard of Tim Keller. He's a mentor and had the privilege of serving alongside Tim for those 5 years before coming here. And so Christ Pres is a multi-site church around Nashville. We've got 4 different locations. And I've also sort of stumbled into a side thing of being what I call an accidental author. I've actually published 5 books, and there'll be a 6th coming out this coming June, and that's all in the last 10 years that we've been here in Nashville. So writing has become part of what I get to do, and that's been a fun part of addition to the ministry that we've had for a couple of decades before that. So anyway, excited to be with you, Davey, and just so appreciate how you're stewarding your story and your own personal pain to help others draw nearer to Christ, as you most certainly have in your own story. And I've benefited, from learning both from you here in the conversation before the recording and also before we actually met here. I've benefited from how God's worked in your life and continues to work. So big fan of you and what you're up to.
Wow. Thank you, man. That means a ton to me. I really do appreciate that. I probably should start with the most important question before we dive into things, and that is, given your daughter is now at Auburn University, please tell me you have not flipped to the dark side. You're not a Tigers fan, are you?
Hey, I gotta be.
War Eagle, no.
A big part of my heart is down there, and tuition goes there too. So
that's true. That's true. I guess you kind of have
to. I'm in.
Well, I grew up in Alabama, and I'm a diehard Tide fan. So
all right.
We can agree to disagree on some things.
It's
okay.
It's all right. Yeah, I'm not that zealous. I won't unfriend you because of that.
That's amazing. Well, one of the things, and we talk about this all the time on the Nothing is Wasted podcast, that despite differences as trivial as sports teams, or as maybe monstrous differences between people as you come across in life, one common denominator is pain. We all experience pain. We all have gone through difficult things, and you're no exception. You've gone through quite several valleys in your life, and you're very public about those. And so I would love to just dive into some of that. If you can just story with us and share some of the difficult things that you've walked through, particularly some of these things that led you into a very intense battle with anxiety and depression.
So not all of my suffering and pain over the years is directly connected to my anxiety and depression, at least not in a way that I'm aware of. But in a lot of ways they do intersect. And so, I am a trauma and abuse survivor from some things that happened to me in my childhood, and actually have just in the past 3 years started to really drill down into that. Never, really lived with sort of front center awareness of the degree to which I experienced, unique levels of abuse in childhood, and of pain, and how that sort of sets certain trajectories in terms of how you respond to the world when you're out on your own. And so we're doing the work, and have been doing the work there for the last 3 years, and it's been very eye-opening. And my counselor has also gotten me connected with a therapist who does this trauma treatment called EMDR, which I highly recommend, consideration for your listeners that have experienced trauma in any way, shape, or form. It's been very effective and helpful for me, for what that's worth. But it all started in childhood, and I think a handful of heartbreaks. Probably the most significant one happened when I was in my early 20s, a couple of years out of college. Like you, Davey, I lost a spouse, but it was a different set of circumstances. 4 months into the marriage, she had announced that she was in relationship with another woman, and so that sort of rocked my world. I was enrolled to start seminary the next year, and she was actually studying herself at a seminary, and so it was a very dark, confusing, disorienting season, and so that took about 3 or 4 years to sort of move past. And thankfully, Covenant Seminary in St. Louis welcomed me there as a single student, and some of the professors there really surrounded me and helped me locate the purpose in what had happened, and helped me learn how to steward my own story, to comfort others. As 2 Corinthians talks about, we pass on the comfort to others who are struggling with the same comfort that we've received from Christ. And so I think that those two experiences, my childhood and then that unexpected loss, I think gave me a compassion that, for sufferers and for those who are going through hard seasons, that have enabled me to show up in ways that I think generally are more helpful than hurtful. We really need to learn how to show up well for people who are suffering, and sometimes that means we have to go through hard things ourselves in order to be prepared, so that we can empathize and that sort of thing. But another one is more subtle, and that is that I grew up in a pretty well-to-do environment, and had a bit of an Ecclesiastes experience. Right? Didn't know God back then, and had a lot of success in academics and athletics and other things, and never lacked anything, and just never was happy until I met Christ toward the end of my time in college. And so those are probably the three main shaping things from younger in life. And then, as you know, as a pastor, I've been a pastor for almost 30 years, and that comes with its own peaks and valleys as well. So,
I feel like you could almost have an entire podcast on pastoral ministry pain, leadership pain, things that you endure that really most of your congregants are never going to be aware of. They're never going to know. Sometimes they're the perpetrators of it, and sometimes they really don't realize or know that. And sometimes it's our own fault that we're kind of self-imposing these things. But, I as you were talking about, particularly this instance with, your wife leaving you right as you're about to start seminary, I can only imagine that being completely disorienting for so many reasons. And maybe you can kind of illuminate that a little bit, because there's a lot of listeners who, as I travel and speak, I'll share our story, and it is such a horrific loss, you know, the way that we lost Amanda. But one of the things I've noticed is that loss through divorce or through some kind of maybe sexual betrayal or adultery is a different kind of loss, and it's heavy. And there are oftentimes people will be like, hey, you know, I know I haven't gone through what you've gone through, but, and I'm like, no, stop. Because Scott, I'll tell you this, I had a dream shortly after Amanda was killed that she was divorcing me, and that if she fell asleep, I was trying to keep her awake. If she fell asleep, I knew it was done. I knew that she would, and I woke up feeling all of those feelings of betrayal and abandonment and things that I've heard since communicated about, you know, walking through some kind of a divorce. And I'm like, why am I experiencing this? And so then I read in Elizabeth Elliot's book, Path of Loneliness, as she was talking to somebody who had experienced a divorce, she said, I've heard now a pain that's greater than death. I wonder what your thoughts are on that.
Well, I would never, I would never, you know, dare to, you know, compare my experience with one such as yours. I mean, I think it's probably next level when the cause of death is murder instead of cancer. And you know, you've got all of these, you know, things that you have to wrestle with the call to forgive, combined with the very appropriate and right hunger for justice, and the very appropriate anger and hurt that you must feel. You know, you were betrayed by a stranger who took the closest person to you away from you, and you know, I would imagine that's a pretty significant, to say the least, trauma to experience. So I would never experience. I would never compare my experience to yours, and say, you know, my experience was harder than yours. But to your point, the experience of betrayal by somebody who is close to you in that way and covenanted to you is devastating. And you know, if she had, you know, died of cancer or something, or in a car accident, at least there wouldn't be the trauma that you have had to go through of dealing with how hurt you've been by a person. You know, by you know, if she dies of an illness, you know, the only anger I have to deal with is toward God, and God can take it, and knowing who He is and what He's like, and that He subjected Himself to the greatest suffering and betrayal in the history of the world. We know immediately that He understands and empathizes and knows more than we do. So yeah. But to your point, I mean, in my case, I would think it would have been easier if she had died in a car accident than making the choice to leave for another person. And that included leaving the faith that we shared as well. And so yeah, but it was, you know, it was 4 months. There were no kids, and you know, so I think I was spared of a lot of deeper pain than, you know, folks who go through that after maybe years of being together and 2 or 3 kids and, you know, that sort of thing. So,
well, that's such a great,
but, you know, worked out well. I mean, I married, you know, my current wife, and, you know, and we've had a great marriage and great life together, and God's hands are all over it. So,
well, it's such a great point for all of us to remember that we really can't compare pain. It's all on different spectrums and different. It's so different and distinct, and yet it's so painful for all of us. Our experiences are, and so it's what do we do with that pain that's most important. How did that, you know, as you're going into ministry, how did that color your approach to ministry then? Having gone through some pain and difficulty, you know, I know that you said that it's only been fairly recently that you become more aware of some of the trauma you experienced as a child. But I wonder, you know, as you think about now looking back, going into ministry, whether it colored it for the good, for the bad, gave you kind of, in some ways, an advantage or disadvantage in helping people or having empathy toward people? What was your experience like as you stepped into ministry then?
Well, I would say that, there's a downside and an upside. I've talked a little bit about how, having gone through various experiences of loss and betrayal and suffering, provides this gift of being able to show up for people who are experiencing similar things in ways that you wouldn't have been able to show up for them as much or as well had you not gone through the things yourself. Yeah. But I think on the downside, especially for those who are, sort of awakening to trauma from childhood or to abuse from childhood. I just remember, my wife and I were listening to a podcast just about a week ago, and it was an interview with Dan Allender, who's a counselor and written some really helpful books.
Yeah.
And especially about recovering from abuse and he grew up as an abused child and talks openly about how his mother had borderline personality disorder, which is a very aggressive, can be very mean-spirited, manipulative. Yeah. And he grew up with that. He was raised by that. And he said, on the one hand, it's often trauma in your past that actually prepares you to lead, to fight against injustice, to fight against, the dynamics of hurt and pain, so that, people will be healed and that sort of thing. So there's a real motivating factor of you don't want people to feel what you felt. Right. And so you tend to be a fighter. Like C.S. Lewis said, Christianity is a fighting religion. It sees what's wrong in the world and it hates what's evil and clings to what is good. But he also said, whenever he got into a conflict for so many years before he was able to do the work and kind of become aware of how his childhood had affected him and his response to the world, he said anytime he got into a conflict, those emotions of how he was treated or that would surface when his mom would treat him in the way that she treated him would surface. And so he said, when I looked around and saw conflict in the world, the whole world had borderline personality disorder. And so my internal response was the same to any kind of conflict, as it was, whenever my mom entered the room when I was a kid. And I think that I probably would say that's very true as well, that my response in conflict has been shaped over the years by, the way that I tried to survive, back at a very young age, and you're kind of formed and you have to unravel some of that. And, but the net effect is that you can climb over molehills as if they are mountains. And, problems become much bigger than they actually are when you're affected by some form of past trauma that you haven't been able to deal with and receive care for.
Wow. You've said a couple things already about this idea of, for you personally, kind of becoming more aware. You just used the term awakened to some past trauma. We found that this is the case more often than not, that especially early childhood trauma gets suppressed so much. It's part of your body's physiological response of survival, but even so much suppressed that you don't even remember a lot of it until later. As you're doing some work, you're becoming attuned to it or awakened to it. What were the things that really began to kind of cause you to become awakened to this? And how, with that, how do we make sure that we become aware of if there's some things hidden deep that we need to uncover?
Yeah, I think for me, it started, Davey, just with my wife pointing out, wow, your response to that was really strong, whatever that might be. And, maybe we should talk to somebody. And so we started meeting with a counselor who lives nearby. His name is Chip Dodd. He wrote a book called Voice of the Heart, which is really, a great book about stewarding emotions and stewarding our stories well. But really it's been through working with Chip for the last couple of years that, he's been able to name some things that I didn't really have a category for, and saying things like, you know that the childhood that you had was not normal. But if it's the only childhood you know, when you're a kid, you think, well, this is normal, but it wasn't. It was a dangerous childhood. It was one in which I had to always be on alert.
Yeah.
And he said, and he said, that's not normal. and so it gives you the freedom to say, okay, I am the way that I am in the worst way that I am the way that I am.
Yeah.
In a way that was influenced and informed by things that were done to me. And so the things that were done to me are not my fault, but now I have a responsibility, to your point, Davey, to take what has happened to me and put it under Christ and do the work that's necessary to heal and move forward as a healthier person. And so, I feel like that's a lifetime journey, don't you? Of you're never done healing from stuff, and so,
man,
that's been helpful. We call him our expensive friend, right?
Yeah.
Sometimes you need an expensive friend because your friends or your church small group just don't have the insights into your heart and into your story or the expertise to help you with certain things. And so that's been immensely helpful to us, and it's hard to envision stopping because it's been so helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. As you're talking about that, I keep thinking about the idea of like generational sin, this concept in scripture that we see where one kind of like sin or methodology of life is passed down inherently, and we don't even realize, but we're just absorbing some of the things that our parents or our grandparents taught us. And some might say that seems very unfair. To your point, there's so much that is done to you growing up as a child. You're absorbing and learning things, or catching kind of these methodologies of how to cope with life, and it's not serving you well later on. What any insight into that as far as what scripture, how it speaks to these kinds of things? Obviously it's great for us to have a counselor, but in addition to that, what would the good counselor, what would Jesus, what would scripture kind of talk to us about when it comes to sorting some of these things out?
So I think the Psalms are so helpful and essential to answer that question, right? Mm-hmm. Because the Psalms are really just a way that God has given to us. He's actually handed it to us, handed the Psalms to us as a way to process the emotional impact, the deep, visceral, heart-level impact of life, and of life in a fallen world. And so, as I've done my work with Chip, for instance, he's identified 8 core emotions that are all there in the Psalms. And what the psalmists always do, whether it's David or sons of Korah or Asaph or whoever it is, they always just boldly name their hurt. They name it. They aren't worried about offending God, as if God, can't take it and gets his feelings hurt and is so insecure that he can't handle our complaints, when meanwhile the Psalms are there inviting us to complain and inviting us to suffer and struggle out loud, not in a disrespectful way, but in a very honest way with God and with where we're coming from. And so those 8 core feelings or emotions that we've been given that show up in the Psalms are sadness, anger, fear, hurt, loneliness, shame, guilt, and gladness. And there are healthy ways and there are unhealthy ways to express all of those emotions. But one thing that was remarkable to me when we started going through this list of 8 emotions is that there's only one of them that is an emotion that feels good. Gladness.
Yeah,
all of the
gladness.
others feel bad. You know,
I was just about to say that.
I know, but those are our emotions, and what a beautiful, testimony of who God is. That He recognizes how impactful our brokenness is. That He's given us 7 different ways to process it. Right. So sadness isn't working for me right now, but I've got anger. So I've got to ask the question, what does it mean to have righteous anger instead of unrighteous anger? Or I really can't get angry right now, but I'm so sad, or I'm so lonely. And I can take that to God and surround myself with healthy people, who can help me process those things. But, the first step is, to the question is to be able to name it. Yeah, and then after that, like the Psalms do, to process it in light of who God is and in light of what God's character is like, right? And so, when we put our circumstances and our sorrows and hurts under the nature of who God is as revealed in Christ, that's where we find the purpose, right? Because He comforts us, but He also says, all right, I'm going to also take your pain, and I'm going to help you rejoice in it, because my people rejoice in their sufferings, because suffering produces perseverance or endurance. Perseverance produces character. Character produces hope. Hope ignites the love of God in our hearts, and you got Paul's thorn in the flesh teaching in 2 Corinthians 12. You've got, Romans 8:28. You've got so much there. All of Romans 8, really, that demonstrates that even the very worst things, even the things that Satan would want to use to destroy us, God takes it and turns it into good. And so there's always hope. There's always possibility. Your story, Davey, and the way that you have stewarded is case in point that God can take something that's intended for evil and turn it into something beautiful in the saving of many lives, to quote scripture. So
That's right. I always like to quote your mentor, Tim Keller. He said something to the effect of, and I think this is in Walking with God Through Pain and Suffering. He said that God gives evil enough space that it will ultimately terminate itself.
Yeah.
That something within this transaction where He allows the evil in this world, it catalyzes something that what you just shared in scripture, that it's producing something in His saints, in His people, that is ultimately going to lead to the undoing of evil altogether. It's this masterful plan that He has. And part of that masterful plan is allowing the suffering. I mean, look at the cross and the empty tomb.
That's right.
Case in point.
Yes, absolutely.
Scott, can you share with us a little bit about your journey? You've been so open about this with anxiety and depression, and I know you said earlier that a lot of these things that we've already talked about, some of them may have impacted that, some of them may not have. But can you kind of talk to us a little bit about that journey?
Yeah. So I mean, really, anxiety and depression for me, they've sometimes come together, but they've usually come separate. And usually when I'm going through a season of anxiety, there's this sense of doom, like the sky's going to fall, the earth is going to break open underneath me and I'm going to fall into it. And it usually has to do with, some sort of irrational fear of loss, right? And biblically speaking, that is always, if it's not, sort of the physiological, chemical kind of anxiety, which is I think separate from the kind of anxiety that I'm talking about. Circumstance-based anxiety, circumstance-based fear, can always be traced back, in my case, to my heart elevating something to a level of importance and a level of significance that it's not entitled to. And, I fear losing this, or I fear not having that. And, it's just this sense of doom about the future. It's, worry is like this, it's meditation, it's committed meditation on a hypothetical worst case scenario, and the gospel's answer to that, which is usually my pathway out of anxiety, especially with things that, aren't changing, is that the long-term worst case scenario for every person who believes in Christ is resurrection and everlasting life and a perfect world. Like that's as bad as it's going to be 100 years from now for you and me, right? That's as bad as it's going to be. And that's also as good as it's going to be. C.S. Lewis talks in his writings about how the life we're living right now, we're still living in the prelude. We haven't even gotten to the first chapter yet of the life that we were made to live. And we're still in the prelude. And as long as we're affected by sin and suffering, we're still in the prelude. And so there's that. But, depression tends to come when there has been a deep loss. My mother died, for instance, a couple of years ago, which I was happy for her. She had, been suffering from Alzheimer's for 10 years, and everybody was ready, for her to go because we had already lost her for all intents and purposes. And, she had a baby faith in the Lord, and so we had a lot of hope, but her death actually triggered a lot of, sort of a flood of some of the stuff from our childhood. And for both my brother and I, it just became this season of sadness and lament and just feeling down. But in every case, the Lord's always brought me out and I don't want this to sound cliche because I know to some people it sounds cliche to quote Romans 8:28, right? That's like always the go-to for people who are a lot like Job's friends who have never actually deeply suffered themselves. And, they quote the verse, which is true, but they don't personally know what they're talking about yet. Right. And you don't want to be too cynical about that, right? Friends are trying to help friends. But that being said, Romans 8:28 is true. And one thing that God says in Romans 8:28 is that he works all things together for good. It doesn't say he works all things for good, right? What happened to you is not good. It's not good. What happened to me? Not good. And we can name it. We're supposed to hate that kind of stuff. Hate what is evil, cling to what is good. That's good. But he says he does say that he works all things together. Right. So you take what happened to you, Davey, you take, what happened to me or what's happened to others, and you put it in with everything else. Right. Who God is, who we are because of Christ in the sight of God, what God is, the work that God intends to complete in us that he's already began. You take all of those ingredients and you put them together, and our suffering. And our sorrows, and our sinfulness, and our guilt and shame that's dealt with at the cross. You put it all together, and God produces good from it. One of the illustrations I like to use is banana bread, right? So I love banana bread. I love that we call it bread, so I don't have to think that I'm eating a cake, which was really what I'm doing. But the main ingredient in banana bread is a rotten banana. Yeah. It's something that none of us would dare try to eat by itself, right? By itself, it's not good at all. But you put it in, and it can't just be any banana. It's got to be a rotten, brown, nasty, slimy, rotten banana. Wow! And you mix it in, and that's the magic that comes out of the oven after you put after you heat it up. And so it's a picture of how God, just takes the worst things. 11 of the 12 disciples were martyred. Almost everybody who wrote a book for the Bible, almost every Bible book was written by somebody facing execution. They were writing from jail, or they were in exile. They were enslaved. Their horrific experiences gave us the Bible, and so I could go on and on about that. I feel like I have gone on and on about it, but
that's so great. That's so great. I'm curious because I feel like that, we'll say things as pastors, and, kind of assume that, like, one of the things I say a lot is we need to apply the gospel to these particular situations. And I would be remiss if you write for the Gospel Coalition. You come out of a phenomenal heritage of really sound Orthodox theology when it comes to the gospel. And what does that look like practically when we say, okay, the gospel saves, right? It's the thing that brings salvation, but it's also the thing that we apply to these particular situations like anxiety, depression. How does that application look like? Just a moment of remembrance, of realization? Does that look like a methodical step-by-step over time? Like when you say that's what I do, to kind of like the pathway to move out of anxiety, to move out of depression, for the sake of our audience, what does that look like, Scott?
It is a grind. It's not.
Thank you.
It's not easy. I mean, it's not easy. It feels when you're in the season, right?
Yeah.
My wife and I have this phrase: "Do the next faithful thing," or "Do the next hopeful thing," right? And it's one step in front of the other. I mean, Jesus said, "Don't worry about tomorrow. Sufficient is each day for its own trouble." And right. I mean, today is, that's Jesus' way of saying, be fully present with the issues of today. Yeah. Recognizing that my mercies are going to be brand new tomorrow. Tomorrow may be a hard day too. Next year may be a hard year. And so one of our elders prayed this beautiful prayer. Okay, so this is an elder in our church who has a child with autism and Down syndrome, both in one child. And it's just been, he's a beautiful boy with a lot of struggles. And their oldest son has been diagnosed with a terminal form of leukemia. I mean, he's in his young 20s, newlywed, and they're just going through it. And this guy, there's a group of us, we were praying together, and he contributed to the prayer. And he said, Lord, and this really stuck with me. He said, Lord, bring us relief. And he was talking about, the pandemic and all the hard things everybody's going through. He said, bring us relief, but not without the revival of our hearts.
Wow.
In other words, if you must keep us in the crucible in order to do your good work in us that you intend to do through this, then don't let us out. Don't bring us to a place of relief until our hearts have been formed. Don't let us waste this season. Don't let us obsess about escaping that which is hard to the neglect of what you're trying to build in us and what you're trying to make of us through it, right? Because even Jesus learned obedience through what the things that he suffered. Even the perfect man had to go through it in order
obedience.
to learn it. Right. Learned it. So, the older I get, Davey, right, my body hurts after a workout, in ways that it didn't used to, and I'm getting signs and signals of mortality, right? And so, I think just getting older helps with endurance. Like, been here before, had plenty of reps with disappointment over the years, and I can't look back on a single season and not remember God coming through. And so it's got to happen again, somehow, some way, according to his timing and according to whatever he's up to. And so I think endurance it's coming slowly in ways that it wasn't there before. But to your question, it's a grind. It's like daily rehab on a busted Achilles, right? You just, it hurts. Like, you can't just get up and start running like a gazelle. You've got to do the work. And spiritual life is a lot like that. People ask, how did Tim Keller become Tim Keller? Here's how. Read the Bible every day for 60 years and pray through the entire book of the Psalms at least once every single month for 60 years. and suffer.
Yeah.
He's had cancer. His wife has suffered with Crohn's disease for decades. And it's been a grind. And you may have heard the interview that he did with Justin Taylor and Kevin DeYoung a while back, where they asked him, "How's your fight with cancer going?" You know, and he said, "I've never been fighting with cancer. What I'm fighting is my heart's response to cancer.
Wow.
I want to finish well." And the other thing that he said, Davey, in that interview is, "It's remarkable, but my wife and I are happier than we've ever been during the season." And this is while he's, like Paul says in Romans 8, facing death all day long, like it's front and center.
Yeah.
He's got terminal incurable cancer, pancreatic cancer, and yet he's finding joy in that place, like Paul found joy in prison in Philippians.
Wow.
As he wrote Philippians.
Well, it's, as you're saying, it is pain and suffering is the necessary crucible to refine our heart, to sanctify our heart, which is so frustrating, right? Because as someone, I'm not sure what your personality bent is, but mine's an achiever. And I'm like, well, can I not refine my heart by doing things or by, and the Lord's like, no, you can't. You can't.
Yeah, you try to achieve, and I'm going to refine your heart as you lose. You lose at things that you really, really want to win at. It's a grind. So I wing 3 as well. So I'm the achiever, but I'm a 4. So like my primary is the kind of the tortured artist type, but my wing is 3. So I understand where you're coming from there.
That's so interesting. I'm the exact flip flop, a 3-wing 4, and so when you talk about some of these, these spaces of being in kind of a melancholic, easily can slip into that depressive type state, I can resonate with that because I can just let my feelings kind of wash over me and just stay there. And, and that's a very, I feel like it's a benefit and a disadvantage all at the same time. The benefit being you don't whitewash your emotions. You really explore them, right? Which is a necessary step. But the disadvantage is that you can easily kind of get stuck there. Yeah.
You can.
Yeah.
You can.
So, Scott, as we kind of close this conversation, this has been phenomenal. I so appreciate your time. I would love to hear, as you're kind of looking out on the forefront, what's going on in life right now and in ministry, what gets you extremely excited? We've talked a ton about the pain that you've walked through and that you continue to wrestle with and battle with. But, we love to talk about the purpose that gets produced out of that pain. Mm-hmm. And it's purpose that really kind of galvanizes that meaning and for what we've walked through. What is some of that really gets you excited to wake up tomorrow and go, hey, this is the work that I get to do, or this is the thing that I get to partner with God in every single day in turning this pain around?
Well, I mean, one is I love our church. I hear so many stories about, pastors that are just worn out, especially from COVID and all that's brought in terms of, interchurch conflicts and things like that. And it's not been a walk in the park for anybody, including us, but, I feel myself emerging from this season feeling more affectionate for the team I get to work with and the church that I get to serve than I ever have before. So I'm looking forward to whatever God has in store in days ahead for us as a community here in Nashville. Yeah. And so there's that. And as timing would have it, per the purpose of your ministry, my 6th book, which I think is probably going to be the most important one that I write, is coming out in June, and it kind of dovetails from your mission. It's called "Beautiful People Don't Just Happen," and the subtitle is "How God Redeems Regret, Hurt, and Fear in the Making of Better Humans." And so, this has really been my headspace for the last year and a half to 2 years as we've put that project together. So I look forward to seeing what God might do with that.
Wow. That's exciting. That's awesome. Well, one of the things, now discovering that you're an Enneagram 4, not to especially as an Enneagram 4, put you in a box, because that's the last thing 4s want. But one of the things I love about the 4 is you can see beauty in everything. You can see beauty in everything. And so even these horrific, terrible things.
It's a double-edged sword. You can see beauty and you can see
trails of that.
Yes. That's right. But in order to be able to see beauty, you've also got to have your eyes open to tragedy. That's the rub. You've got to hold both in tension. But 100%, right? Wow. It's what they call the tortured artist's personality. You feel heaviness really heavy, but you're also able to appreciate beauty, including the beauty of God in remarkable ways.
Wow. It's incredible. Well, Scott, thanks so much for spending time with us. We really appreciate you making the time and you sharing some insight and some wisdom for our community. And we just really appreciate your work. I'm looking forward to that book coming out in June. We'll make sure that we put those resources up on our, on this page.
Great.
And,
awesome.
And thanks again. Thanks again for spending time with us.
Thanks. My pleasure.